Everybody.
It's fantastic.
It's 3 o'clock. Welcome to the Department of Geography Colloquium. And our speaker today is Dr. Joel Correia. He's an assistant professor in the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. He holds a bachelor's degree in geography from Humboldt State University, a master's in Latin American Studies from the University of Arizona, 2012, and a PhD in geography from the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2017. He's a human geographer. His research and teaching focus on the intersection of human rights, justice, development, and environmental change, with attention paid to indigenous politics in Latin America. Thanks for coming down and give us a talk and zooming in. Take her away, Joel.
Thank you very much, Tim, for the generous introduction, and thanks so much to the Department of Geography at University of Florida for the opportunity to share this work with you. It's wonderful to be back and speaking with you all. It's been a couple of years since I was last had the opportunity to share some work with you, so thanks for that. Thanks as well to everyone who is watching live or will be watching via the tape version. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen to this talk, which is titled Between Flood and Drought, the Production of New Waterscapes and Environmental Racism in South America's Gran Chaco. And in this paper, I'm going to be drawing insights from critical physical geography and settler colonial studies to discuss environmental racism through the production of new waterscapes in the Paraguayan Chaco. This is a working paper. I'll be resubmitting it very shortly, so I welcome some comments and feedback on my approach. It's also somewhat experimental in many regards, so I'm trying to work with some frameworks that are relatively new to me, so I really look forward to your questions and suggestions at the end of the talk today. So let's see. All right. So the talk today draws into conversation how physical geography plays a role in the manifestation of settler colonial extractive regimes and their effects on environmental racism in South America. And while I will be discussing these issues in relation to Enxet and Sanapaná territories in the Paraguayan Chaco, it is necessary to begin by acknowledging that the University of Florida and the city of Gainesville, from where I give this talk, are located on the traditional unceded territories of Timucua and Seminole peoples, a fact that sheds light on the counter topographies of racialized dispossession that shape what Gregory might call the colonial present that we inhabit. And although such acknowledgements can be seen as liberal performativity because they do not alter the structure or relations that cause the need for making such statements in the first place, I nevertheless begin this in this way because startlingly few people are aware of such histories and their ramifications on the present and everyday life, as students in my classes regularly tell me when we discuss these issues on day one. Therefore, it is my hope that bringing sustained attention to these issues will do more than just name injustice, but inspire action and build new solidarities, something that I hope to do through my research, but also this paper that I will be speaking about today. Okay, so to give you a brief overview of where this conversation is going to go, I'm going to start with a bit of the problem, discuss the argument and kind of goal for this paper. I'm going to then move into the study design and discuss some of the methods and data. And then I've structured the paper around a few different kind of main components. One, looking at settler colonialism in the Bajo Chaco, and then moving to physical geography and discussing briefly some critical approaches to that and my understanding of that, and then moving back into this question of understanding settler colonialism through the production of waterscapes specifically and cattle ranching in the Paraguayan Chaco. And then we'll look at waterscapes and environmental racism, or waterscapes as environmental racism among many of the communities where I have been doing long-term field research in Paraguay. Let's see. So to give you a sense of where I am situating and locating this work, I know many people aren't super familiar with the Gran Chaco. It's the second largest forest ecosystem in South America after the Amazon. So it spans, and it's largely a dry scrub forest. It spans from Argentina through the western half of Paraguay, which you can see here on the screen, up into Bolivia, and there's a little finger that reaches into Brazil. I do most of my work recently for the last several years in the Paraguayan Chaco. Today I'll be also talking about an area that's often referred to as the Bajo Chaco. It's actually the humid Chaco of the Gran Chaco region, so it's more susceptible to higher precipitation regimes. And then also specifically within that, I'll be talking about the communities of Samocasec, Jaque-Axa, and Sohoyamaxa, with three communities that I've been working with for many years, Enxet and Sanapaná communities. And I'm just going to point out as well, kind of this green polygon that just appeared on the screen that you can see is really showing the ancestral territory and extent of the Moskoe language family, of which Enxet and Sanapaná peoples are part of. This was prior to colonization, to give you a sense of a large extent of land and territory with which Moskoe peoples, practiced regular regimes of mobility to work with environmental change and seasonal conditions of flood and drought that I will get into in a few minutes. But before I go into that, in her recent work, Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger, Julie Z suggests that environmental justice scholarship and action often utilize story to disrupt certain forms and explanations. So this paper seeks to denaturalize Enxet and Sanapaná dispossession by showing how physical geography plays a central role in the shape of settler colonialism, but also how settler colonialism and settler colonists rather utilize physical geography of this space to advance the logic for existence, that is through ranching. And so in the spirit of Z's recent argument that storytelling is a core tenet of environmental justice scholarship and activism, I begin with a quick story to set the stage of what I am discussing today. So as we sat near a smoldering fire, hoping the mosquitoes would avoid the sweet Palo Santo smoke, Clemente received a phone call. After a brief exchange, he ended the call with a triple affirmative, oima, dale, listo. In other words, he was ready to go, and it was time to go. And with that, we jumped into the little Toyota that I had purchased for field work, along with 3 other men. Our task that day was to drive 35 kilometers down a rutted dirt road to pick up some gifts for Clemente's community that was involved in a land reoccupation. We arrived to find 25 large black plastic bags full of used clothing and toys alongside 10 pallets of 12-ounce plastic bottles full of water. Water access is a persistent problem that produces severe hardships and health issues in indigenous communities like Zamocasec, where Clemente lives, and also across the South American Chaco. Clemente looked at the pile saying, "They always bring us gifts before Christmas." The items were donations gathered by a church in the capital city over 400 kilometers away, a group that gave annual gifts to Zamocasec in solidarity with the community's fight for land rights from the Paraguayan state. The problem, Clemente stated, was that they just leave everything on the side of the road and that we have to carry it back on motorcycles. But now we have your little truck, so let's fill it up and get going. So we loaded the goods into the back of my small SUV until the shocks sagged and began the day-long process of ferrying everything to Zamocasec. What you're seeing in this video here is actually footage of Zamocasec. Well, it's panning over the territory right now, and then it moves as it pans back around. You see the actual road that we drove down that day. So the summer sun traversed the sky as the pile of bags and pallets grew larger in Zamocasec and smaller on the side of the road until we had moved it all. After the move, people had discussed how to divide the goods among the 63 families living in the community. While waiting for items to be shared, 2 women watched the bottles of water being dispersed to each family when one casually said, "I only drink good water once a year." Though I was already aware of the challenges Enxet and Sanapaná communities face concerning water access, the woman's comment spoke volumes about how the geographic specificities of settler capitalism in the Paraguayan Chaco have produced a waterscape that supports cattle life, but exposes indigenous bodies to environmental harms, from floods and droughts to intestinal parasites. The notion of the waterscape has been primarily applied to urban context to consider state formation through water control, racialized geographies of water insecurity. However, scant literature actually evaluates the formation of settler colonial waterscapes and their effects on indigenous water access. So this is actually the road that we drove down that day. And in this talk, I'm drawing from an eclectic body of data, and I will talk about that in a couple moments, but I'm drawing from one of the household questionnaires or responses that came from that household questionnaire from Ignacia of Zamocasec. And she was reflecting on these questions and issues of water access and where she gets her water for daily consumption in her household as the household head. And she was reflecting and she said, when it floods, the water runs everywhere. It becomes dirty and it makes us sick. When the rains stop, there's less water and it starts to smell. It gets full of mud and it is hard to drink. Between the floods and droughts, life is hard. Water access underlies fundamental concerns about environmental justice and human rights violations in Sanapaná and Enxet communities discussed in this paper. International human rights courts determined that state denial of Enxet and Sanapaná communities' land rights drastically impacted their ability to access clean water, and that was attributed to the violation of right to life in Jaki Aksa, Sohoyamaxa, and Zamokasek, determined in 2005, 2006, and 2010. Historically, indigenous peoples across the Chaco did not regularly suffer grave consequences due to the abundance or lack of water because of their ability to move freely and their mobility across space, as I showed in that previous map with the ancestral territorial extent of Moskoy language family. And so because mobility across that space allowed them to utilize and access necessary resources in relationship to changing climatic conditions. So why has the regularly occurring flood and drought cycle become malignant and even deadly for many Enxet and Sanapaná communities? And so the argument that I'm making in this paper is that the landscapes created for settler capitalism and cattle ranching in the Paraguay and Chaco interact with the biophysical environment in ways that actively and disproportionately produce injustice for indigenous peoples living in those spaces. This can be seen through land dispossession and the way that tenure regimes operate, but it can also be seen and viewed through the access to clean drinking water or the lack thereof and its effects on everyday life. So the methods and data that I'm drawing from, this is part of a much broader study, and I'm just actually teasing out one little facet of that study that I hadn't really worked with in any other place, but it's really pertinent to the work and to broader arguments that I've been making. So this is really situated within 18 months of field research that I've been conducting between 2013 and 2020. I'm talking about a little subset of data from that. It's really drawing from a set of non-scientific household questionnaires conducted largely in Zamokasek and Sohoyamaxa. I was unable to do them in Jaki Aksa and was also thwarted completing in Sohoyamaxa due to getting dengue. But nevertheless, I have some rich insights from community members in these spaces, in these three different communities, about questions of water access and issues that relate water access and drinking water to biophysical, or rather physical, harms in the body. And so those are complemented with photography and drone imagery, as well as participant observation in this time. I complement these household questionnaires to really think through this question of flood and drought and its impacts on life with archival research, drawing from missionary and colonizer accounts. And so who you're seeing there is Barbara Grubb, and the first Anglican missionary to really take charge of the colonizing efforts in the Paraguay and Chaco and really set the path for opening up that space to cattle ranching, and set forth a whole series of conditions that I will unpack in a few minutes that really set the structures of colonial encounter in this space. We also complement in this paper the production of waterscapes through a recent mapping of water infrastructure. So with help of Brittany Green and Nasha Grenau, we've actually mapped out different facets of the water infrastructure that has been created to support cattle ranching in this area by taking two subsets of the Bajo Chaco and mapping out about 11,000 square kilometers of land to actually quantify all of the different kinds of forms of water infrastructure that have been produced in this area to support cattle ranching. And I'll tease out some of that later as well to show the kind of true effects and impacts and scale of this kind of the waterscape and land and waterscape changes in this area. Sorry about that. But my approach to research Enxet and Sanapaná peoples is animated also by a commitment to Indigenous research ethics, collaborative research, and guidance from the communities at the core of the study. And actually, the household questionnaires that I'm drawing from and that I drew from were conducted in response to community interests and community desires to have a specific set of information created through the research process that I was doing and to leave with communities. That's one reason why I haven't really worked with this data so much in my own research, is because it was done in response to community interests. And so we left that the results of these studies with community members to use in their own claims before the state. And then since that time, in conversation with community members, I have been given permission to use this information in this data now. So Also want to say that per community government's norms, I discussed the intent of the questionnaires and received feedback during community-wide meetings, and where we talked about all the different questions, the form of the and scope of the study itself, and how these kinds of questionnaires would be unrolled, with whom, and in what regards. And so that's all part of this broader process of conducting this research that I think is imperative to impart before going further. So moving on to the settler colonialism in the Bajo Chaco, part 1. So it's important to understand within the relation of cattle ranching in this area how this kind of unfolds in this relatively recent process. The Paraguayan Chaco was not colonized or explored by mestizo or European colonizers or settlers until the late 1800s. In fact, Paraguay just fought a war called the Triple Alliance War against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay from 1864 to 1870. It was a devastating war for the state of Paraguay. They lost almost 50% of their territory through that process. 90% of the male population was killed in the battle, and the country was devastated economically from that. And so one of the vehicles that the state pursued to kind of make up its resources in the wake of this devastating war was to parcel off and sell the entirety of its western territory, which is the Chaco. So the Paraguay is kind of divided into two territories, if you will, the western and eastern area. And the western Chaco is what you see in this map by Fontana from 1885. And this is the first kind of parcelization of that entire region. And you're looking at here areas of land value assigned by different colors. So in red is the highest value. The capital city, Asuncion, is down here in this color, in this area right here. It's Asuncion. This is the Paraguay River. So all these lands and parcels are accessed by the Paraguay River. Red is of the greatest value, then yellow. Green is of the third greatest. This was intended to be state territory, this gray block here, but then that was all eventually sold off. And so this is really phenomenal because it spurs, this land sale spurs the first kind of colonial imperative into this region, whereas previously it was seen as a region without value, a wasteland that was either flooded, hot, thorny. Settlers or explorers called it a green hell. There was significant indigenous resistance as well. So it was just kind of like left as an empty wasteland that had no kind of value or reason for colonization, if you will. However, in the wake of this land sale, several British investors started purchasing large tracts of land. So these are tracts of land being sold by the League. They're enormous. And so we have like significant international investments in these areas. And the Anglican Church is impelled to begin a missionary process in this area at that time. And this isn't just a unique thing. The Anglican Church had a missionary endeavor in several areas of South America at that time, particularly the Argentine Chaco and the Paraguayan Chaco. And within this imperative, is really sending out missionaries to essentially build an indigenous labor force and to settle and tame this area for the expansion of British investment interests. And this is something I explore much in greater detail in my book project. But in this paper, I'm just talking about it really briefly right here. But what we see in this map that I'm showing you now is, again, Barbara Grubb, who was the general commissioner of the Chaco. He led the colonial kind of the colonial penetration of the Paraguayan Chaco. It's he was the person who drove the Anglican Church into the Chaco. They called it driving the thin edge of the wedge into this space in some of the colonial narratives and accounts that I have read, and trying to like literally open and break open this space for the incursion of cattle ranching to follow behind. And one of the core vehicles that Grubb used to fund his to locally fund his efforts was to start cattle ranches on the small mission stations that he established in this area. So what you're seeing here is the primary area of the Anglican Church's missions and all of its mission stations in this different part, or in this specific part of the Chaco. This is Mopay Sensac, is the area of Zamocasec specifically, and then Jaque Axa and Sofia Maxa are located right in this area right here. What I think is particularly interesting as well is reflecting on the colonial encounter in this area. Right Reverend Edward Every in 1950, writing, he's an Anglican bishop or Anglican reverend, writing on this, this experience, reflects on the Chaco itself. And he calls the Chaco, he says, the Chaco is still a land in the making. is consisting of a vast dreary plains covered with ant hills, palm trees, low scrubby forest, and broken up by numerous swamps. Hence, as no white man coveted it, it formed for centuries a natural Indian reserve. The conditions, however, are now rapidly changing as the land has been found valuable for running cattle and the Indian no longer has country to himself. And this is really a fundamental kind of, I think, framing of how what Moreton Robinson might call the white possessive that operates in and through the appropriation of indigenous lands that helps create racialized regimes of exclusion that function via property rights and perceptions of economic value. Whereas previously the land was seen as a wasteland because it was just a indigenous reserve of no interest to the white man. Once it starts to be seen as having some potential economic value, it drives the colonial imperative into this space to reappropriate the space and the labor in those areas for the extraction of value. And this isn't something unique to this area. This is a core tenet to the colonial encounter across geographies all across the world, right? But what I want to also tease out and say that is different or distinct in this area as well is to think about the question of not just colonization, but of settler colonialism specifically. And if we're thinking about Patrick Wolf and his work on settler colonization, and thinking about settler colonization as a structure, not an event. So colonization is not, in this regard, something that happens merely as a time period and then ends with a post-colonial or independence period, but it actually sets up a structure of social and spatial relations and the extraction of resources in such a way that it endures to the present. And so Shannon Speed has reworked this and rethought this theorization of settler colonization through her notion of settler capitalism with regard to Latin America by looking at the ways in which indigenous peoples have been dispossessed in place on their lands to become also the labor force that have worked on their lands. Whereas Patrick Wolf is pointing to different geographies, arguing that indigenous peoples were dispossessed from lands and the labor that was used on their lands, the stolen lands of indigenous people, were that of enslaved Africans. Shannon Speed reworks this a bit in the context of Latin American extractive regimes, and I'm extending that kind of argument here with regard to the Paraguayan Chaco because it's an analysis has much salience in that region. And if we look at kind of the ways in which, and thinking about the work of the Anglican mission in this space, it was quite significant. In my analyses in other areas and other works that I've been doing of the Anglican colonization of this area, the fundamental goal was to create an indigenous labor force and also to create a space for cattle ranching and cattle capitalism. And so what we see here in this map, which is adapted from Powell, is that each of these circles here is a private ranch. And each of them is a private ranch that in the 1970s had enclosed and included within it an indigenous labor force. So essentially entire communities of Enxet and Sanapaná peoples that had been living in this whole area prior to colonization, with the ways in which the enclosure of the Chaco happened through that land sale. You had the enclosure and sale of lands with indigenous communities inside them, the Anglican Church working to create an indigenous labor force that then stayed on those lands, but became essentially indentured servants for cattle ranches in these areas. And this persisted for quite some time up in and through the 1970s and even into the 1980s. There are still documented cases of forced labor taking place in Paraguay with the United Nations Special Rapporteur on labor making a pretty robust analysis of this taking place further up in the northern Chaco in 2017. So it's still something that persists, and these are kinds of this notion of the structure of relations that continues because settlers come to stay, and this structure of colonial relations continues to be maintained through the ways in which resource access is limited and reworked through these types of social spatial relationships. And it really is about and functions on this question of cattle ranching and creating and promoting a landscape that is amenable to cattle ranching, because due to the persistence of flood and drought, it's not seen, and also the specific soil types, it's not seen as a landscape with which can support any other major economic activities. And so what we see in the Bajo Chaco of Paraguay is a more than human colonization of this space as well, whereas cattle by far outnumber the presence of humans in this area. So if you just look at the kind of scope and scale of cattle production in this area today, This is data from 2020, and looking at in Presidente Ages. So these are the three main administrative regions of Paraguay's Chaco. Presidente Ages is where Zamocasex, Sohoyamaxa, and Jaque-Axa are all located. Boquerón and Alto Paraguay are the two other departments. You look at estimated total head of cattle of 2,276,000. Estimated human population is about 82,000, and the indigenous population is approximately 20,000. And then we can look at as well this data for other departments as well. At the end of the day, what you have is a landscape where cattle outnumber people approximately 50-1 in the Paraguayan Chaco. And it's really like thinking about this ways in which the entirety of the landscape of the Paraguayan Chaco has been totally transformed to support cattle life that is destined for slaughter, while at the same time dispossessing indigenous peoples from their ancestral territories and lands in ways that persist to the present and intersect very closely with this question of water access as well. Whereas many studies will focus on questions of indigenous dispossession with regard to land because of its importance, but I'm also trying to expand and extend some of that through thinking about the effects of that on water access. And so if the Paraguayan Chaco was a land in the making in the early 1900s, cattle ranching therefore has since made the Chaco. Nothing has had a greater impact on social environmental systems in this region than cattle capitalism. An economic system where value exchange and social reproduction revolve around the production and slaughter of cattle for profit. If for Lefebvre, abstract space is produced through the reconfiguration of the social vis-a-vis the state and capitalist political economy, cattle capitalism produces space through radical reconfiguration of territory and resources by the indigenous settler relations that have made the Chaco. And so the point that I want to make here is not that settler colonialism has happened in this area. It's happened in many areas, we know that, but the form that settler colonialism has taken in this area of Paraguay is strongly influenced by the physical geography that it utilizes as a way to advance its spread and endurance, but also settler colonialism strategically, or the way that settler colonists strategically appropriate land to use it as an active vehicle of settler colonialism. So I'm going to switch now to think about the physical geography of the Bajo Chaco a bit, give you a sense of what we're talking about. So the topography plays a key role in the Paraguayan Chaco. It's an extremely flat area. You're looking out here in the west, again, the Paraguay River on this side. So the darker green areas are approximately 60 meters in elevation, moving upward to the north, or excuse me, this is the east, moving upward to the northwest. You have around 600 meters in elevation, but it's a very, very flat, very, very gradual gradient that flows downhill from essentially the slope of the Andes, but further to the west, all the way down to the Paraguay River. And this is significant for a lot of different reasons, particularly because it is just it's very, very susceptible to flooding, which I'll show in the next slide. And if we look at these kind of close-up image of LiDAR here, what you see is essentially the topographic change that appears in these images is largely just from the cutting down of trees and the creation of pastures. I don't know if you can see it on your end, but you have very kind of small, well, appearingly small in this area, patches of land that are cleared out to create essentially cattle pastures in this area. So this Via Ages, this department here is where Jaque-Axa, Sohoyamaxa, and Zamocasex are located, just to keep you kind of connected to what I'm talking about. And this topography is also significant. This flat topography is significant because it also intersects with the ways in which the type of soil that you have present there. So this is largely in the Bajo Chaco, and this part of the region here is almost entirely the soil type are clays that are not very permeable and very salt laden, and this is quite significant. And if we tack back to some of the colonial accounts, you can think about the ways in which they have been portrayed in those accounts. We have folks like Hunt arguing in 1911 that the Paraguayan Chaco, for the most part, is a level plain with an imperceptible rise towards the northwest, abounding in swamps, sluggish streams, and numerous palm forests, except in the west and north, where it takes the nature of a park-like country of dense shrubby forest land. So the wilderness in this country is subject to extremes of drought and flood, with few natural resources, compelling its inhabitants to lead a nomadic and precarious life. Speaking of indigenous peoples in the Chaco prior to colonization. The topography plays an important role when we start to think about the delivery of water through the precipitation regime over the year. And you have very highly spatially variable delivery of water, marked by floods, marked by thunderstorms that end up resulting in extreme flood events that inundate large areas of this region. But on the other side, what you have is a very marked dry season. So you have this natural kind of dialectic of flood and drought that marks this entire region. So when you have the delivery of water, huge expanses of land, flood, and then on the opposite side of that, you have prolonged periods of the year where you have actual extended drought times. And then in between years, over time, you have several periods where years themselves will be entirely dry or entirely wet, creating a very challenging landscape to navigate. And so that is another kind of part of the ways in which that influence the form of settler colonialism. That influence the form of settler colonialism in this landscape, because the delivery of water and the prevalence of flood and drought dramatically impact the ways in which extractive regimes can operate in this area. And the Bajo Chaco is notable within the Gran Chaco bioregion because it is largely marked by palm and grass savanna. You have somewhere between 1,200 and 1,000 millimeters of rain per year. And it is this forest, savanna, palm, water, vegetation mosaic that really indicates the subhumid and semi-deciduous forests in this area that are either noted by short-term flooded forest formations or palm tree savannas. And this natural kind of grassland here that you're seeing, of course, this is highly altered over time, but there's a large prevalence of grasslands that really drew settler colonists to this area for cattle ranching. But on the flip side, trying to manage and work with the question of drought has always been a challenge for settler colonists. And so I think that, on the one hand, what I'm trying to do is show here, not make an argument for environmental determinism, and that's to say that, the physical geography determines the form of settler colonization, but to argue that settler colonists adapting to the physical geography in specific ways to have it facilitate their kind of extractive endeavors in this area. And I want to also kind of turn now from thinking about physical geography as a descriptive kind of facet of what I've been talking about to thinking about what Lave, Bierman, and Lane suggest with regard to an approach to critical physical geography, where they're arguing that the social and environmental injustices on which human geographers focus are profoundly material. And therefore, they suggest that we cannot understand their co-constitutive relations without studying the biophysical and social processes together. So one thing that I'm trying to do in this paper is to draw these social processes into a consideration of some of the biophysical processes that take place in the flood and drought regimes of the Bajo Chaco, to think about the ways in which settler colonization is inherently kind of related to those processes. So the physical geography of the Bajo Chaco is therefore not a backdrop for settler colonialism, but has been appropriated by settler colonists as a vital element that facilitates the endurance of settler colonialism. Extractive and indigenous dispossession in Paraguay's Chaco must therefore be evaluated beyond merely identifying structures of settler colonialism to consider how place-based settler capitalism operates lockstep with physical geographic processes to produce social environmental injustices. So I think that critical physical geography offers a valuable framework to think with by providing an avenue to evaluate physical geography, not merely as the landscape where settler colonialism happens, but as an active facet of how settler colonialism operates. And I want to then turn to the second kind of element here of settler colonialism and focus specifically on the production of waterscapes. So ranchers have adapted to the seasonal precipitation variability by creating a new waterscape. Swingadow's brilliant analysis details the production of the modern Spanish state through the creation of new waterscapes and the resultant socio-natures. If we extend a similar logic to the ranchers who settled the Bajo Chaco, control over water resources was fundamental to producing new socio-natures necessary for the operation of cattle capitalism. Indeed, cattle ranching in the Chaco can only be sustained through the control and provision of scant freshwater resources. The ranching landscape, the ranching waterscape is thus defined as much by fence lines that restrict cattle movement and denote the spatial extent of private property as it is by the construction of check dams that fill small reservoirs, large earthen stock ponds that collect flood and rainwaters, as well as rainwater catchment systems installed on buildings. And although these elements of the ranching infrastructure are not as spectacular as the mega infrastructure projects that feature in other analyses of waterscapes, such as those by Swingadao and Attaker, they are no less significant. In the aggregate, stock ponds, check dams, and fence lines radically reconfigure the hydro-social relations, drawing attention to how water becomes scarce for some populations while abundant for others. We can tack back again really quickly to thinking about how settler colonists have framed this, and then thinking about how that's manifest in the contemporary landscape or the contemporary waterscape. So Hunt is in his accounts in 1925 is arguing that when Grubb got back to the central station, he commenced the making of a large reservoir to hold about 1,000 cubic feet of water. Floods are unpleasant, but unless they become too excessive, life is possible for man and beast. A water famine, drought, on the other hand, is one of the most serious contingencies to guard in the wild country where inhabitants have to rely on natural conditions and uncertain rainfall. Another kind of framing of this that also draws together the land and labor appropriation dynamic that I was talking about comes again from Hunt, where he argues on, or he reflects on May 2nd, 1918, we've had a terrible drought, but luckily today 2 inches of rain have fallen. This will fill the water holes and save our cattle for another 2 months. Nason and I are busy in between times making a lake to secure a safe water supply. 1 mile long, half a mile wide, and 3 to 4 feet deep. A big work truly and nearly finished. The Indians have worked well. So really within the content of this text, you not only see the ways in which the biophysical landscape is being transformed to create new waterscapes, but you also see the central role and the appropriation of indigenous labor within that. So successfully running cattle in the context of flood and drought regimes requires the production of new waterscapes, particularly to deal with drought. That's the most important element here. What we see in the Bajo Chaco with regard to this is really the construction of what are called tajamares or stock ponds. This is a tajamar, and this is what they call in Paraguay a tanque australiano, an Australian tank. It's an elevated tank, and they work in tandem. Whereas rainwater falls, collects in, or flood water drains into these earthen these earthen holes carved out of the ground, and then is pumped, either this is with a solar panel, but often through a windmill, pumped up into a tanque australiano, where it's then gravity fed out to other areas where cattle can access them on different parts of the ranches. And if we look again, so if we start to look at what these look like in the landscape and their prevalence, we start to see some interesting facets of the ways in which this waterscape is manifest in contemporary landscapes. So here you're seeing, this is Sohoyamaxa, located along Ruta 5. These are all houses here. You can see, of course, a stream coursing through the image, but you also see several tajamares. And some of these tajamares were constructed to help provide earth to elevate this road through this floodplain, and some of these tajamares were constructed explicitly for cattle ranch, but both operate for, at the end of the day now, both operate for provision of water for cattle ranches, but they also function as key water sources for indigenous communities now. We can look at tajamares and see their shapes take many different forms. So we have here tajamares like a large lake in a sense, a small excavated pond in the midst of a community. This is Jaque Axa, located on the margin of the highway. This is a tajamar next to a tanque australiano. So you see here part of this windmill, and this is a tajamar covered in weeds, and this is just another small tajamar. In each one of these sites, my interlocutors from Sohoyamaxa, Jaque Axa, and Zamocasec obtain water. This is just another image to give you a better sense as well of what a tajamar and tanque australiano look like together. So this would be the tanque, and this is the tajamar in the front. And if we turn then back to this kind of mapping project, as I get closer to wrapping up this talk for today, we have 2 study areas, and I'm still working with analyzing some of this information, or with analyzing this information because it's all fairly recent to me. But these are really the infrastructures of settler colonialism in this area, these tajamares, the prevalence of them. So we have 2 study areas that equate about 11,000 square kilometers. This study area has Zamocasec within it, and this study area has both Jaque-Axa and Sohoyamaxa. There are also several other indigenous communities located in these spaces. So those two red squares show Sohoyamaxa and Zamocasec respectively, Zamocasec here. Moving over to the Zamocasec quadrant, what we see, the only point that I've gotten to so far in analyzing some of this is just very raw, kind of like numbers, quantifying the presence of these features. But you have in this area 2,177 tajamares, 601 tanque australianos, and 9 check dams. Of course, the settler waterscape also operates alongside the Trans-Chaco Highway, so a major highway, and many secondary roads that don't appear on this map. But you can see, you can at least get the sense of the scale and scope with which these kinds of alterations to landscapes are being made to ensure cattle have access to water in dry times, right? As well as thinking about the ways in which, so all of these little gray lines, they're not lines of topography, they are streams that are coursing through this area, but you can also think about the ways in which roads actually intersect with and change water and surface flow in this area. Something that I hope to bring into the revisions of this paper. Also, with the Sohoyamaxa quad, you have 2,132 tajamares in this area as well. You can see many are located along this main road, Ruta 5. You also have a road here, but nonetheless, they serve a dual purpose. On the one hand, they are used to build the road to raise it above ground, above the floodplain. But on the other hand, several ranchers have told me in interviews, they're like, I love it when they come to do road work because then they just carve a new tajamara on my land. You know, they'll take down the fence, they being state officials will come in, take down the fence with, you know, permission, dig out earthen tajamares, use that earth to lift the land, and then leave the hole in the ground, which then fills up. In the context of the ways in which indigenous land access has been restricted in this area through the establishment of cattle ranches, which occupy well over 95% of the entirety of this entire study area, tajamares are the only real option now for access to water. Surface water in these streams is often saline due to the soil type, as well as the subsurface water in this area is also saline. So the viability of wells is not an option. So it's either rainwater catchment on the roof of a building or the construction of tajamares. Due to the material impoverishment of Enxet and Sanapaná peoples through their exclusion from these extractive regimes, it essentially ensures that the only source of water is through the tajamar, which is the same place where cattle and other animals go to eat and drink, rather. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has found that the ways in which these exclusionary regimes have operated for the persistence of ranching in this area, the ways in which ranching has unfolded in this area, is directly related to human rights violations against Enxet and Sanapaná peoples from Jaque-Axa, Sohoyamaxa, and Zamocasec. I'm not going to read all this text, but these are two extractions from Inter-American Court of Human Rights judgments on the Sohoyamaxa and Jaque-Axa cases, where they note in the Jaque-Axa case, this top block here, you know, that blood and fecal samples show, you know, the high prevalence of parasites and other things like anemia. These are preventable diseases, but nevertheless are diseases with which are disproportionately experienced by indigenous peoples in this area because of the ways in which they have been dispossessed from land and therefore living on the margins of cattle ranches in many places, and therefore also have to gain access to water only through the spaces that are built for cattle as well. So drinking very, very dirty water and very, very, very precarious water sources themselves. And this has led to, across the 3 different communities in Jaque-Axa, Sohoyamaxa, and Zamocasec, according to the Inter-American Court, 41 deaths that they had found, noted, and recorded in their cases. However, that number is likely extremely low given the fact that verifiable deaths in these instances were quite challenging and that those cases were decided upon in the early 2000s, yet none have been resolved to date. And so these issues are still things that are still affecting community members. So as I wrap up, I want to just draw and tease out a couple of observations from the household questionnaires that I was doing. And Inocencia from Jaque-Axa tells me that the kids usually get fevers or diarrhea when there's too much water. And you can see here, this is what some of that everyday flooded waterscape that Enxet and Sanapaná people often live in looks like. You also have the regular prevalence of death because of the infrastructure in its other forms through the ways that flooding operates in this area now, and the marginal conditions with which state officials essentially maintain indigenous communities in these spaces. And this article here argues that the headline is that, you know, water condemns indigenous peoples in the Chaco to death. Two children in isolated communities, or children from communities isolated by floods have died in the last week because there's a lack of roads that are resistant to the rains. When we look on the other side of drought, so if we're thinking about being between flood and drought, we think about some of the other responses to some of these household questionnaires. You know, Eveldina from Sohoyamaxa says, when it's bad, the water smells, and we use a shirt to strain the mud. This is a picture of a small tajamar with the water receding in a more of a drought period. And you can see just visually, not only is there trash and other kinds of debris and waste in the water itself, but also high sediment load just by looking at it. You see, this is also not something that is unique to these communities that I am doing my work in, but it also appears regularly in different news sources. This from July of 2020. Communities in the Chaco are drinking water from small kind of puddles because of the drought, is what it says. But it also says here that some 96 indigenous communities are severely affected by the lack of water in the Chaco. And they explain that because it's been 2 months without rain in the region, and the tajamares are running out of water. And so then there is nothing left to do but to drink water from areas like this. And that is a regularly occurring response to many of the household questionnaires and surveys that I administered in in Sohoyamaxa and Zamokase. So the United Nations suggests that human right to water entails having sufficient, clean, and accessible water with 50 to 100 liters needed to meet basic needs. There is no access to filtered, treated, or well water in Zamokase, Sohoyamaxa, or Jakeaksa. Over 95% of the households surveyed reported that their primary source of water for cooking, drinking, and sanitation is either from stock ponds, tajamares, seasonal ponds, or small reservoirs behind check dams. Moreover, the ability of families to capture rainwater or store water obtained from surface sources fell well below amounts suggested by the United Nations. Surveyed families in Zamokasek reported an average household water capacity of 33 liters per person, and families in Sohoyamaxa reported an average capacity of just 2 liters per person. So this is a picture of a woman in Sohoyamaxa filling up some of her water containers, some of which are old oil containers, some of which are old chemical containers. And across both communities, the most common storage containers are 10 or 20 liter plastic buckets, while a small number of families have fiberglass storage tanks. So if the infrastructures that facilitate settler extractivism in this area are tajamares, roads, and ranches, the infrastructures of Enxet survival are t-shirt filters that remove largest sediment, old plastic bottles once used for automotive lubricants and agricultural pesticides, and what Diago and Ramirez call the constellations of co-resistance that always seek to build spaces of life built on the already existing infrastructures of liberation formed through grounded relationalities, and systems of solidarity. So I want to suggest in closing that an investigation of contemporary environmental injustices that Enxet and Sanapaná communities navigate benefits from critical physical geography's attention to the production and effects of socio-physical systems. And as a critical human geographer whose research generally employs qualitative methods and ethnography, I approach critical physical geography from a social science perspective. In so doing, I draw insights from critical physical geography with attention to the political economy of land use decisions, critical environmental justice, and settler colonial studies because, as Robertson, Larson, and Tulawecki have said, relationships of social power shape or are shaped by the biophysical landscape. So I suggest that an integrative approach is necessary to provide a nuanced analysis of the roots of contemporary injustice, to denaturalize indigenous erasures, and support ongoing struggles for human rights. With that, I am actually going to close the talk because it's gone a little bit longer than anticipated, and I'd love to hear some comments or feedback. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Joel. That was wonderful. We'll now entertain some questions from the audience here.
Hey,
No,
Tim,
sorry,
I've
Mike.
got one.
Yep. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I can't get my video to go. That's okay. You don't need to see my face. Yeah, Joel, really interesting. I noticed you focused on the physical geography, which I think is, perfectly valid. But I'm wondering if you thought about any of the ecological dimensions that would tie into changes in the physical geography. And it seems that when you focus on the physical geography, that forces you to focus on water as a vector of environmental injustice and harms. And then when I think about the analogy, well, it's not exactly an analogy, but the advance of settler colonialism into the Midwest and High Plains of North America, you had a situation where one herbivore replaced another. So the cattle came in and replaced the bison, and the bison were critical to the survival of the indigenous peoples that were dependent on them. So the real vector of harm there was the degradation of the protein source. And so I'm wondering if it's a grassland, right? The area that you're working, are there any herbivores, or have the food supplies been affected, the historical food supplies of the indigenous people? Is there a hunger aspect to the environmental injustice?
I think that's a really interesting question. And thank you for that, Bob. There certainly is nothing parallel to the bison in this area, but there's an abundance of smaller mammals that people regularly would hunt and eat and rely on for subsistence. Those kinds of nutritionary regimes have changed quite a bit with different changing economies over time. But there is still actually a significant prevalence of game like capybara and armadillos. Fish are really prevalent in this area, so a lot of people will fish for food sources and things like that. I haven't looked specifically at how that has changed over time with regard to the incursion of cattle ranching in this area. I think just off the cuff that it would probably be a greater impact in the northern Chaco of Paraguay, where we've transitioned from a wet kind of flood drought kind of complex to primarily just arid. There's still significant rainfall in the northern Chaco, but it's a much more arid region, and the type of landscape change that is currently taking place for cattle ranching in that area is severe and extreme. So it's had some of the highest rates of deforestation globally. You have massive deforestation taking place, and what you see then is a radical altercation of the landscape. Whereas in the Bajo Chaco, what's interesting is instead of seeing that large scale kind of clear cutting of land, you see actually kind of the enclosure of land and selective clearing of trees over time, because much of that palm savanna kind of stays intact in many areas and is somewhat amenable to ranching in lots of spaces. That's starting to change more recently, but for the last up until even probably the early 2000s, it really wasn't changing significantly. Now, just very recently in the last decade, 5 years, actually in the last 5 years, you're starting to see rice production and those types of things. As we start to see rice production and certain types of tree production, new tree production systems that are being implemented, I think you'll see more direct effects on the types of game and animals that are available for sustenance. But I haven't yet seen that, and I haven't looked at it though, to be totally honest, but I think it's a great question, something I'll definitely consider.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else? We're sorry we're running just a little late. I know some people have to leave at 3:50 for other obligations. Anybody else? Last call. Okay, well, we're going to call it. And thank you, Joel. Very interesting talk. And again, we appreciate you coming down, zooming in of Latin American studies, and wish you well in all your research endeavors. Thank you so much for a great talk, and we'll see you down the road.
That sounds good, Tim. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Thanks everyone for taking the time to show up today and to listen to the talk. If you have any thoughts or comments, please feel free to contact me. Look forward to continuing the conversation at any time. So take good care.